You don't have to be a politician, but you do have to understand politics.
Should chief executives be preparing for a change of leadership?
It is a huge deal.
Isn't this the time to also start backing our own businesses?
I mean, the country itself has to look investable.
If there was a single silver bullet, someone would have found it by now.
Bring me more outside in. Bring the future to now.
This week, politics, always a big issue for business, but perhaps now more than ever with war in Europe, Trump charging around, and China extending its reach across the world. How can business people keep on top of it all and avoid the pitfalls and hopefully benefit from the opportunities?
Welcome to The Business. I'm Hannah Prevett, Associate Business Editor of The Sunday Times.
And I'm Dominic O'Connell, Times columnist and business correspondent at Times Radio. Today we're bringing you a bonus episode of The Business, sponsored by PwC.
Now, the world is always changing, but I think it's fair to say this does feel like a big moment. At Davos, of course, we had Mark Carney, the Canadian PM, speaking about a rupture in the world order. And ahead of the Munich Security Conference, Marco Rubio, the US Secretary of State, described a new era of geopolitics.
So what does all this look like for business? What are the tensions, the traps, and the opportunities to look out for? Our guests today are Marco Amitrano, Senior Partner, PwC, UK and Middle East.
Also joining us is Lord Gavin Barwell, political analyst and former Chief of Staff to Prime Minister Theresa May. Gavin is also an advisor to PwC. Welcome to you both.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Marco, you went to China recently with a UK delegation that included the Prime Minister and several UK business leaders. Tell us a bit about it.
First of all, I thought it was a really important trip to make. I think it was really important for us to, as a country, to begin another level of building relations with China. So, and we were unbelievably well received. So it was about developing the basis of relationships again. It was about a platform for something rather than going there and coming back, with a load of agreements, a load of deals, or a load of assets. And I think if you can frame it in that, developing a platform for something in the future, it was a very successful trip.
Gavin, could you put it into context for us? Because your former boss, Theresa May, I think she led the last trade delegation to China when she was PM. So that's quite a long period in between. And before that, of course, we had the love-in, Cameron Osborne, absolute love-in with China. Yeah,
and I think if you spoke to David Cameron or George Osborne now, they would think that went too far. Theresa was a little bit more realist. We then had a period where maybe UK governments didn't want to engage at all. And I think what Keir Starmer is trying to do, and it's an incredibly hard balance act to strike, is he's trying to maintain the relationship with the US, get back closer to Europe, and be a bit more pragmatic with China, all at the same time. And in the current geopolitical context, that's not an easy troika to pull off.
At the end of it, did you get the feeling that there is a new basis for a relationship? Because often these trade visits just come and go and they're forgotten about.
Yeah, I think China is long-term. Chinese culture is long-term. This was about an initial commitment to build on. There were some very productive conversations and one or two deals, if we could call them that were done, or agreements or mutual commitments. But it was about establishing something to build on in the years ahead.
And what about the politics of it, Gavin? What freedom does Keir Starmer or any UK government actually have to negotiate a proper bilateral relationship with China, given that the US and Europe really cracked the whip on this?
Yeah, I think it cuts both ways. So there's both, at what point would the United States say to the UK, hang on, what are you doing here? So there is a limit there.
Europe might say that as well.
Europe might say as well, although the Europeans are to a degree trying to do the same thing. There's also a flip side, which is, to what extent do the Chinese think it worth negotiations? I think the Chinese at the moment look at the UK and Europe and think you're basically not going to do anything if Trump tells you can't do it. They looked at how the UK and Europe responded last year when President Trump increased tariffs, and basically both were forced to compromise because we're dependent on the US vis-a-vis Ukraine and for security. So I think as long as that remains the case, the Chinese are going to think, well, there's a limit to how far this relationship is going to be able to go independent of the US.
And how far have the power dynamics changed in that sense since Theresa May's trip in 2018?
I think there's quite a big shift in the geopolitical environment overall since then. I think in relation to China, its kind of ascendancy as a technological power has accelerated since I was working in Number 10. I think if you look across the main domains of technology at the moment, there's some areas where you'd say the Chinese are in the lead on maybe green technology, some maybe semiconductor chips where the US is still in the lead, somewhere it looks 50-50 at the moment. So China's kind of advanced technological, I think, is the most striking change since the time I was.
And it's increased in its kind of fast innovation capability. Do things very, very quickly, disseminate them into society, into the hands of young people very, very fast.
Well, as you say, I think those kind of transformative technologies, it's the same with things like graphene, right? Graphene was invented, innovated here, but will largely be commercialized in China. And on that point about kind of technological innovation, has China pulled so far ahead on some of those technologies that we frankly can't compete in the UK, or should we still be trying?
I think there are a few where it's very hard to, if you take battery technology, for example, UK, not just the UK, but Europeans, Americans are quite a way behind. Under President Biden, the US was trying to catch up. President Trump has actually pivoted and decided, actually, we're not going to try and compete in that race. We're going to focus on fossil fuels. And so to me, one of the most interesting bits of geopolitics that doesn't get commented on as much as it should, I think, is the world's two largest economies have taken diametrically opposite bets on the future of the global energy system. And one of them is going to ultimately be proved wrong. So yes, I think there are some areas where we couldn't catch up. And the challenge for the UK, and we did some work, PwC did some work on the industrial strategy in this space, is what are the areas where actually we do have the advanced manufacturing, where we do have some areas where we are competitive and we can build on those strengths.
And what are those, Marco?
Well, look, I mean, we are great innovators in this country. So when you actually get, think about where Google's advance in artificial intelligence started, it was in the UK. Bioscience, we are very strong in the UK. We are able to source great talent. We are able to give it the freedom to experiment. Our issue is scaling. Our issue has always been keeping it and scaling it. But, we know for overseas investment interest in the UK is always in our ability to innovate. Where are new ideas coming from? Where do they look like they've got a future? Yeah, we have almost China, America, beyond, always circling, looking for the source of those things are here to take back into their own systems.
Let's actually move on from China to the US, because we touched on President Trump before. I think one of the biggest ways that geopolitics has interfered with business or been present for business has been tariffs. Trump's big thing, of course, when he first came to power in his first term and then in his second term as well. Yeah. Where have we landed? We had the most recent threat on Greenland, that went away. But the people you talk to, Marco, are they still coping with this new world where free trade is no longer free trade?
We have seen tariffs go from being a kind of economic financial tool to being a political tool, right? And, something that is, tariffs on, tariffs off, we've seen now repeatedly used to achieve other things. But conceptually, they are settling. I don't think we've seen all of the impacts of the tariffs yet. In fact, I'm sure we haven't, that are already bedding themselves in, partly because businesses will take time to absorb tariffs. They won't all translate into price increases. They can't. But they will slowly drip through. We have not seen the full inflation impact of tariffs yet, in my view.
So inflation is one thing which will hit the world economy, actually, US everywhere. Have you got UK clients who've stopped doing business in the US because of tariffs?
Not stopped doing business, but perhaps been a bit more cautious about it and looked for options elsewhere.
Move manufacturing to the US, perhaps? Or
look, I mean, that was really one of the very openly stated objectives of President Trump, was for people to move their investment to the US. Some have done it. Some have considered it. Many have not, and are just looking again for optionality, whether it's in their supply chain or indeed their customer base. Where can they offlay the risks that are now been introduced to their business because of tariffs? And
you've hinted there at the kind of unpredictability both of Trump and the kind of tariff strategy, if you like. Is there a sense that some are still waiting to see, frankly, what happens next? Like, can you plan for 5 years' time when you can't plan for 5 days or 5 weeks' time?
Yeah, there's an interesting... It's actually about 4 or 5 years ago, there was this magic number out there among chief executives of 400 days, and that was known to be the furthest ahead you could see with any certainty in business planning. So, 3-year, 5-year plans, you sort of think, good luck with that. And I'd say that was 4 or 5 years ago. It's probably a lot shorter now.
Is it 100?
Let's say it's probably somewhere between 250 and 350, but it's less than a year. It's less than a year. Now, what do you do when you're used to linear business planning and you have stakeholders and shareholders that want a level of certainty? You have to scenario plan. You have to be as agile as you can be, and you have to have a number of scenarios that you can that enable you to switch in your decision making to keep stability in your business. That's why we often talk about stability in terms of an economy related to political stability. The reason we want stability is so businesses can plan better, so that 250 to 350 days can get back up to 400 or beyond. I mean, there was a time where you could do a 5-year business plan with a relative level of certainty and accuracy. We're just not in that world anymore.
Well, so we talked about tariffs. That's part of Trump's external agenda. What about, Gavin, his domestic agenda? If the polls are right and the midterms work out that he loses control of the House, does that mean then that we have a much quieter, much less turbulent remainder of Trump's term?
I think much is doing a lot of work in that sentence. I think a bit less turbulent. There will be more, if you think about the American system, you've basically got two constraints on the presidency, the courts and Congress. And Congress has not really been acting as a restraint because the Republicans have got both houses and Trump is pretty much in control of the Republican Party. So if the Democrats win the House or the House and the Senate, there is going to be some more constraint there. But President Trump is a disruptor and he's not going to change his basic modus operandi. And in foreign policy, he's got a bit more leeway vis-a-vis Congress than he's got in domestic policy. So I think your basic thesis is right that there will be a bit less turbulence. But I think you'd be being optimistic to think it's going to...
No less noise. No less noise.
We talked about tariffs, but what about the difficulty for multinational companies managing their workforces in the US? So obviously, we've seen lots of companies row back on the DEI pledges, as they have to be. Lots of them are cozying up to Donald Trump in various ways. How do you manage that as a CEO? So if you've got employees here who still very much care about DEI, but it's been expunged from their website and all of their literature in the US, I mean, that's very tricky, isn't it, Marco? Oh, sorry, to clarify, DEI, diversity, equity and inclusion.
Yeah, no, I'm very familiar with that term, Hannah. Look, it's tricky. Actually, I go back to when I was elected into my current position as a senior partner at PwC. Actually, Gavin said to me, I'll never forget it. He said, right now, he said, you don't have to be a politician, but you do have to understand politics. And this is how I would answer your question. CEOs just have to understand politics, probably more than they ever used to have to. And it's not the sort of dark arts end of it, if I can use that term, Gavin. It's how does policy work? How does policy get made? How is it executed? What are the channels? Who are the influencers? Where do you need to be listening harder? I think that's fair, Gavin. I mean, if you build on the advice you gave me as a CEO.
Yeah, I just think in a disruptive world, business just has to have much more regard to where policy is going to shift, and therefore trying to understand why politicians do what they do and trying to place yourself in the shoes of Donald Trump or Keir Starmer. How are they viewing the world? Why are they thinking what they're thinking? And I think on DEI specifically, the challenge I think there for business leaders is you've still got all the same challenges about talent acquisition and talent retention, and trying to make sure that your business is getting all of the best possible people in that labour market into your firm. But you've got the political challenge, and you could have it in the UK here as well. I expect, Farage and Reform are sceptical about DEI as well. So the language that you're using publicly and in your documents is that getting you into a political scrap that you don't want to be in. So how do you keep going with the underlying drive whilst avoiding the kind of political hot water?
And it's also managing in a time where employees expect their employers to stand for something, right?
Absolutely.
So they want them to talk about Black Lives Matter. They want them to talk about DEI. They want their companies not to be involved in ICE raids, frankly. We've seen that with employers over the last few weeks.
Capgemini.
Yeah. Look, I mean, you as a leader in business, a leader of a large workforce, you're expected to speak out. And you want to, but you want to in a way that makes sure you make everybody feel at home. I think in a very diverse workforce, I mean, in PwC UK alone, we have, 24,000+ people. very diverse, and we benefit from that. We're across everything, including generational. And so, you have to hit the key point that everybody would recognise when you do speak out, which is humanity, which is inclusion, which is making everybody feel safe and at home and that they can be at their best. Sometimes that's tricky when something has really seriously destabilised, like some of the events we've seen over the last few years.
Let's shift the focus a bit closer to home with Russia and the war with Ukraine, which is entering its 5th year this month. We've just had the Munich Security Conference at which European leaders spoke about the divisions within NATO. Gavin, are the promises of more money for defence realistic, and what does it mean for other parts of spending?
So I think they are going to happen. I think the commitments are bigger and more, and they're happening more quickly in Northern and Eastern Europe. And the further away you go from Russia, the less urgency there is about it. And I think the UK and the Prime Minister's kind of hinting that he might accelerate the UK's trajectory a bit, because at the moment it's not that rapid. But you raise a really good question, which is, well, how's it going to be paid for? And in the UK at the moment, all of our political parties are committed to increasing defence spending, and nobody has an answer about how it's going to be paid for. It feels to me very unlikely that it's going to be paid for by more borrowing, given the fiscal position that the UK is in. And therefore, it's going to be some combination of cutting spending in some other areas or raising some taxes.
There's some weird speculation a couple of weeks ago about some kind of a carve-out from Rachel Reeves' fiscal rules to allow more borrowing to pay for defence spending. So do the politics allow that, do you think?
So it's possible. What they're talking about, I think, is some kind of pan-European vehicle that you would set up that would be off-balance sheet. So that might be possible for a few of the big capital programs, but it's not going to fund the whole thing. The challenge, I think, essentially European heads of government have got is that at the end of the Cold War, we took a huge peace dividend. We massively reduced defence spending. We increased spending on health and welfare. And now we need to increase the defence spending, but no one wants to cut the health and welfare spending. So
I'm only laughing because I never like the sound of off-balance sheet vehicles.
You're right to be
as an auditor, it sends a chill down my spine.
But I'm sure the teams at PwC who advise on defence and corporate finance and defence are crawling all over the industrial bit of the political bit. So if they can't get the politics together, what hope do they have of any kind of European defence industry integration, which has been talked about for years? But frankly, the French and the Germans just don't want to play nicely.
Well, but look, they have to find a way, don't they? We just have to find a way. I mean, the imperative is so clear. You just hope between all the people who can influence these systems and the politicians, we find that way, we find that right vehicle. It's not insurmountable, Gavin, is it?
No, but I think you've put your finger on the hardest bit of it, right? It's one thing to find the extra money, difficult but doable. The real challenge is look at the number of equipment programs that we have across Europe compared to the United States. It's a really inefficient way that we're spending the money at the moment because everyone wants to protect their national champions on every issue. And that is going to have to change. But I do think, to strike an optimistic note, one of the things that worries me at the moment, a little bit about the debate, is we're almost scaring the public about this. We are perfectly capable of defending ourselves against Russia. By we, I mean Europeans collectively. The European economy is way bigger than the Russian economy. What it requires is the political will to spend what is necessary and a 4 or 5 year period to build up capability and keep the Americans committed to European security in that kind of phase over period. But nobody listening should be in any doubt whatsoever about the ability ultimately of France, Germany, Poland, Italy, UK, Spain to properly defend themselves against Putin's Russia.
Well, we welcome that note of optimism, don't we, Dom? But what does it also mean for kind of British businesses? Could they get a bigger slice of the defence pie? And, looking at the industry that I cover, technology, there's some great defence tech companies out there. Isn't this the time to also start backing our own businesses, Marco?
Yeah, it is, totally. And we do. It comes back to my point earlier, Anna, about we are innovators in the UK. Technology-enabled things, and defence, clearly one of them. From what I've seen, and actually my colleagues around Europe would say the UK's got a lot of what the whole of Europe needs. Finding our way through the regulations, and if you forgive me, Gavin, calling them political barriers that still remain for post-Brexit, is the hard part. Certain commitments being required in order for UK companies to play. I mean, we've still got a bit of that to remove, haven't we? Yeah.
The Commission has played quite hardball on the negotiations on that, and Keir Starmer will want to see if he can get some further movement. But I think if you look ultimately at Europe's defence industrial base, the UK is one of the kind of key players there.
Yeah.
So there is real opportunity. And you're also right in the way you framed the question, not to think about this narrowly in a kind of defence sector base. The tech sector, the real estate sector in terms of basing and logistics, there's a whole load of kind of adjacent sectors to the defence sector that could benefit very significantly from, if you look at Germany alone, the envisaged increase in German defence and infrastructure spending is bigger than the post-war Marshall Plan. It is a huge deal. And if that is replicated across a whole number of European countries, there's a big economic opportunity there.
Let's touch briefly on UK politics before we before we wrap up. Gavin, should chief executives be preparing for a change of leadership?
Yes, I think they should definitely be preparing for one. I don't think it's a certainty. I think the media are slightly overstating the inevitability of it. But I think that, if you look at the public polling, it's clear where the Prime Minister stands in terms of public opinion, not in a good place. If you talk privately to Labour MPs, most of them are pretty disillusioned as well. So I think the most likely outcome is that there is a change post the May elections. But there are two reasons why it might not happen. One is, unlike my old party, the Labour Party doesn't have the muscle memory of how to remove its leaders. It let Jeremy Corbyn lead them into a general election. And secondly, there isn't an obvious successor. If you think about the kind of names people talk about, Andy Burnham's blocked at the moment. Angela Rayner's got her HMRC issue she's still got to sort out. Whereas Streeting Labour MPs, I think, are nervous how close was he to Mandelson. So those two things...
Khan's, you have to talk about... What is
but so this is one of the things that used to really frustrate me when I was in Number 10. People would put their name forward to be Prime Minister who hadn't served in any senior job in government. And I sat for 2 years watching Theresa May doing that job. It is an incredibly difficult job. I often get asked, have our politicians become less good? Given all the chaos we've had in the last few years. But if you think about, in different ways, Theresa, Boris Johnson, Rishi Sunak, Keir Starmer, they were all successful people in their own spheres before they came into that top job. And they've all found it in different ways very, very difficult. So I find people putting themselves forward who haven't got anywhere near the requisite level of experience.
But it strikes me, I remember Tony Blair saying when he came into office, he was his least capable and most popular, and when he finished, he was his most capable and least popular. It's kind of part of the system.
Marco, does it make any difference to the chief executives if they're trying to strategize about a change in Prime Minister? A jump to the left, perhaps a bit more taxation. Can you make any meaningful plans on the back of what we think the way the politics is going?
Yeah, I would say, Dominic, it depends, right? Actually, I would say there are times not to be distracted by it. And there are times or situations where it could be very relevant. It depends, and we to build on what Gavin's saying, who the options, who the likely people might be. Where does that take the country in terms of three important things: fiscal policy, regulatory policy, industrial strategy? Those things can move against business or for business. And actually, if you had the feeling that a change was going to make fiscal challenges more difficult, tax regime change, regulation tightening, lowering your ability to take risk, and industrial strategy really being a little bit watered down with no incentives anywhere, no focus anywhere, I think as a chief executive, depending on what industry you're in, you've got to start going, hang on a minute, this could be problematic. And therefore, you would be looking into your scenario planning and going, which one are we most likely to be in? Where should we be pursuing growth now?
You talk in quite general terms, but the rubber has hit the road on this a few times. AstraZeneca deciding not to extend its vaccine factory. A couple of other big pharma companies withdrawing from the UK, going to the US, putting their money into the US. So the talk of a change in leadership does have real-world repercussions in jobs and technology.
Yeah, it does. Look, I mean, the country itself has to look investable. And I do talk in general terms because our client base is every industry, in every angle, every size. But one of the things we do every year, our 29th CEO survey was launched in Davos. Now, that's something where we survey nearly 5,000 chief executives around the world, and you get some really good, meaty data out of that, of where business sentiment is, industry by industry, country by country. One of the questions we ask those 4,500 to 5,000 chief executives each year is, what are your top three destinations for international investment? Where are you going to put your money? And actually this year, The UK remained number 2 in terms of the most mentioned. The US, distant number 1, not surprising, looking at the economies booming there and the focus of it around technology in particular. But the UK showed up as number 2. A year ago, we were number 2 all by ourselves. This year, we're number 2, having been caught by Germany and India. So there's a wake-up call for the government there in terms of, look, other countries are gaining ground in marketing themselves. So we have to be marketing ourselves. And actually, our Chancellor, the Secretary of State for Business and Trade, were in Davos doing exactly that. And actually, the China trip was about that, albeit specifically to Chinese investors. But we've still got a good standing. We can lose it, though. And I think the ground we lost between 2025 and 2026 needs to be thought through carefully. To me, that's why this potential change in leadership needs a little bit more focus. What does it mean in terms of the marketability of the UK to international investment?
And obviously a key part of the problem is that Labour has just been unable to get any kind of growth going at all. What's the problem there, Gavin?
No money, I think.
I think if there was a single silver bullet, someone would have found it by now. So I think there are multiple problems. I think the overarching problem is he's not done what he said he was going to do before the election. What he told all of us before the election was that growth was going to be the overriding priority. It would trump anything else. And that isn't what's happened. On multiple issues, he's compromised, whether it's immigration or how close to get back to Europe or whatever you're looking at. He hasn't gone full-throatedly for the pro-growth options on everything. And that, I think, is part of his underlying political problem, that people don't know what he's for. And then I think the issue is that there's a whole load of kind of complexity underneath that. This problem has been with us as a country ever since the global financial crisis. You'll know this, that our productivity growth has never got back to where it was before then. And that would suggest to me that there are multiple issues that need to be tackled in order to get that to where it needs to be. The big hope, I guess, is AI.
Yeah.
Could be sort of part of the solution to this. But
We do have to unlock some capital, though, don't we?
Yeah.
I mean, that is where the fiscal rules come into play.
Just before we move on to try and boil this down into some advice for business, surely the one surefire bit for any chief executive thinking about politics is get your arm around Nigel Farage's shoulders. Because some chief executives are still quite nervous about doing that, aren't they? Despite what the polls say.
So I've definitely been engaging with reform.
Yeah.
Definitely that.
Completely.
Yeah.
I think that the kind of narrative that's out there that he's a surefire to be the next prime minister is overstating it quite a lot, because there's very strong evidence, both from real world elections, there's a by-election in Caerphilly before Christmas, and from opinion research, that lots of people are motivated to vote tactically to stop reform winning. So in other words, in simple terms, Nigel Farage is political Marmite. There's a chunk of the electorate that really loves him, and there's a bigger chunk of people that really don't want him to be prime minister. And the polls, the headline polls, don't pick up that tactical voting. So I would be advising any business, reform is almost certain to have a large number of MPs in the next parliament, and you should definitely be engaging with them. But don't assume it's a foregone conclusion what the result is going to be.
And for us at PwC, it's exactly that. It's understanding the policies on behalf of our people and our clients, of a party that, has a bigger and bigger voice. You have to understand it.
So I think we've established there's plenty for UK CEOs to be thinking about at the moment. Marco, how can chief execs increase their business resilience? We've talked a bit about kind of scenario planning, but it certainly seems like, and there's plenty of surveys that suggest that the job of a CEO is harder than it's ever been, with lots of them worrying they're going to lose their jobs in the coming year. So what can they be doing in practical terms to boost their resilience in this current climate?
Well, so many aspects of an answer I want to give you to that, Hannah. But we've said scenario planning. We said, making sure that you've developed optionality into how your business works, the business model, the operating model, the cost base. Then I think there's certain things don't ever change. They might become more or less important, but having the best team around you as a chief executive cannot be underestimated. A diverse team, a diverse thinking team, and then foster a leadership style that makes sure you're listening to everybody all of the time. That's easier said than done at times. So that's key. Lone chief executives are definitely more vulnerable in environments like this. And then, I have the great benefit of advisors like Gavin and others who, again, bring that outside in. when I talk to our chief executives as our as clients of our organisation, but also who my job is to have relationships with, and I say, what can we do for you? What can we do right now in this environment for you? And they say two things: bring me more outside in, bring me more things that I'm not aware of, and then they say, bring the future to now. Help me get out there and what's going to happen, and help me get ahead of it now. And AI is probably the best example at the core of that. I mean, we could pick other things as well, but what they don't really just want to know how technology or AI works or how the engineering itself is developing. They want to know what it can do and, crucially, what it can't do. So, I often say technology isn't innovation, actually. What technology can do is innovation. What you use it to do is innovation. So, and every industry has disruptors, including my own. We have disruptors. Actually, you can either fear the disruptor, you can sort of demonize, if you like, the disruptor, or you can actually embrace and celebrate the disruptor because they teach you stuff. And actually, a world with the disruptor in is a better world for you as a big organisation because you learn more and you use your depth of resources and relationships to then build on that.
What about you, Gavin? Because obviously you're part of that, bringing the outside in. You're an advisor to several other companies as well as PwC. So what advice are you giving the leaders of those organisations at the moment?
So I think if you're looking at how a business can be resilient rather than an individual, I would pick two things. One, Marco's covered. I think AI, the potential that offers for people to come in with a completely new way of doing whatever you do.
It's a completely new way, isn't it?
Yeah. Right? And actually, coming back to the previous question, if you think about politics as a market, it's being disrupted at the moment, right? Two companies have dominated it for 80 years, and suddenly there are some new challenges there. But the other thing that the most likely manifestation of all the geopolitical issues that we've been talking about in terms of an impact on a business is the cyber threat. You think about the last 12 months, M&S and its online offering, or Jaguar Land Rover stopped from being able to make cars for several months because of these cyber threats, and they are heavily correlated to geopolitical risk, essentially. So I would, at a business level, I'd be thinking about AI and kind of the potential of that to disrupt our market, and then the cyber threat, and what is my kind of minimum viable business in terms of the systems I need to keep running, both in my own business and in my supply chain, in order to carry on doing the basic thing that my business does.
I think it's really interesting that you mentioned cybersecurity, actually, because we haven't talked about it for a few weeks here on the podcast, but we had Alex Baldock, the chief exec of Currys, in, and he was saying that they face attacks every single day. They're fending them off. And I think it's perhaps important that we don't lose sight of cybersecurity in the midst of all of these other challenges.
Yeah, perhaps the lesson both of you are drawing from everything we've talked about is this idea of protecting yourself a bit, actually. Protection from AI, or getting on top of AI, and protection from cybersecurity threats. Resilience, in other words.
Yeah. Well, look, resilience isn't, you have to remember in business that resilience isn't just about stopping bad things happening. It's about enabling lots more good things to happen. So resilience is often a word used with a defensive standpoint. Actually, it is about getting on the front foot and being able to take risks that you otherwise might not have been able to take.
Well, Gavin and Mark, you've been very generous with your time, and you've taken us all around the world and brought us back to the UK with a pretty positive message at the end. Thank you very much.
Thank
Pleasure.
you.
Thanks for having us.
This bonus episode of The Business is sponsored by PwC. PwC knows how your business works, so you can put AI to work for your business. Discover more at pwc.co.uk.
Please get in touch. Do let us know what you think of the show. You can email us at thebusiness@thetimes.com. We want to know what you think and what you'd like us to cover.
We're back on Thursday. Don't forget to subscribe to our YouTube channel, or you can get us on your usual podcast app so that you don't miss an episode you wouldn't want to of The Business. Bye for now.
Goodbye. See you next time.